My name is Margaret Torn, and of Lawrence Berkeley Lab and UC Berkeley, and I'll be the moderator for the next panel. The panel is a panel of distinguished scientists who will discuss the scientific dimensions of what's at risk, climate model predictions, and the physical and biological impacts of climate change. Before we start, I would like to make one short announcement that we do have headsets for simultaneous translation. If you need translation into Chinese, those headsets are in the lobby. We'll have 3 speakers, and then all 3 speakers will come up to the stage, and we can have discussion and time for your questions. The first speaker is Inez Fung, professor at UC Berkeley. She's the first Richard and Rhoda Goldman Professor in the physical sciences. She's a professor in earth and planetary sciences and environmental policy, science, and management, and she's one of the members of the National Academy of Sciences affiliated with Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. Thank you.
It's a pleasure for me to talk today about the problem of climate change and global warming. I've been working on this problem for 25 years now. I hate to admit that. And we've been working first the physics of the problem, the mathematics of running huge models, and now the data are coming in. And I would like to start by saying that I'm worried, very worried. So what I would like to spend my time here is to explain to you why I'm worried. This is a picture, obviously, of China, and down there, if I could have a pointer, please. I'm from Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is obviously in this. I have to figure out how to do this. Hong Kong is here, a very much polluted Hong Kong that I came from, not when I was there. So this is the culprit. CO2 has been increasing. These are highly precise measurements at Mauna Loa Observatory on top of Mauna Loa, about 3,000 meters, 3.4 kilometers above sea level. And what we see is Dave Keeling's record and now the NOAA record. The CO2 has increased from about 315 parts per million to now over 380 parts per million. Parts per million means if I grab 1 million molecules of air from the atmosphere, I get 70% nitrogen, etc., but 350 or so would be CO2. So CO2 is a very minute, present in very minute quantities. But what we see, as you saw from Dr. Chu's talk, is that now it's 380 in 2005. In the pre-industrial era, it was 280. And during the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, it was 180 parts per million. So it's a very rapid increase of CO2. The CO2 is a natural thing. I breathe out CO2, plants take in CO2. But what is happening, so there's a natural cycle of CO2, there are plants taking in CO2 and decomposition, returning CO2 back to the atmosphere. CO2 goes into the ocean and there's gas exchange and it comes back out. But where the issue is that there's fossil fuel combustion that we all are aware of. The fossil fuel is old carbon, about over 100 million years old. And so now we are moving the old carbon out of geologic storage into the very fast cycling between the atmosphere, land, and ocean. And hence, this is the cause of the atmospheric CO2 increase. If we look at this in a different way, the carbon budget now from 1980 to the recent years, the top curve is the fossil fuel emission. And this yellow patch on the bottom is the atmospheric CO2 increase. So what this is telling us is that what we see in the atmosphere is only approximately 50% of what the fossil fuel emission is. The rest of it has gone into the ocean and into the land. And where the storage capacity, whether the ocean and land can continue to store the carbon at the same rate is very much an issue that we're concerned with. Why are we concerned about CO2? We all know CO2 is a greenhouse gas. What is a greenhouse gas? It's like my students, okay? They get excited, okay? CO2, this is CO2, so CO2 can do this, okay, at particular wavelengths. CO2 can do this, okay? So in that excited state, and this is a very specific wavelengths. You know, I like Bach, my students don't like Bach. They get excited by other wavelengths, other frequencies, okay? So by doing that, they absorb, and this is what we mean by absorption. The Earth's radiation gets into these excited CO2 molecules, okay, they flap around, okay, and so the energy, instead of going out to space, is trapped. And so this is what we see here, the energy budget. So what we get from the sun's energy, and this is approximately 100 units coming in, about 20 units is absorbed by the atmosphere. About half of it reaches the surface, okay, and some reaches, and it's reflected back, okay, 30% is reflected back by clouds and by the snow and ice and by deserts. Okay, so for the Earth's energy, for balance, there's 70 units going out. But what we see here is that with CO2 and greenhouse gases, there's a down radiation. This is absorbing the Earth, is radiating at a particular temperature, is radiating. Some of that energy goes out to space, but some of it, a lot of it is absorbed by the CO2, water vapor. Water vapor is another greenhouse gas that gets very excited in the atmosphere. So other greenhouse gases, and those radiate up and down, and this is what gives our planet a very habitable planet. Without this downward radiation, the Earth would be much colder. We would not be able, would be about at least 15 degrees colder, and we would not have all three phases of water, and it would be all mainly ice. So when we have a CO2 forcing in the atmosphere, if we increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, several things happen. One is what we call feedback. They're amplifiers or other things that may diminish or amplify the forcing. So if we have CO2, we have an initial warming here, then evaporation from the ocean, if we have a warmer, this warming, the CO2 will warm the surface, the evaporation from the ocean will increase the water vapor in the atmosphere, and water vapor being another greenhouse gas, get excited in the atmosphere, absorb the radiation, and so this feeds back into more warming. Okay, if the water condenses and we have cloud cover, increase in cloud cover will increase the reflection of sunlight, and so that is a negative feedback, or this diminishes the warming. And on the other side, the three phases of water, if we melt snow cover, then this decreases the reflectivity of the surface from about 60% to about 10%. Then this increases the absorption of solar energy, and so this also warms. So where we have, while we are very certain about the physics of CO2 warming, the excitation of CO2, where we are disagreeing, when we hear about uncertainty, it is in the marvelous Earth. We have three phases of water, but the partitioning of the three phases of water is something we're still working with. But the bottom line is, it doesn't change the conclusion, is that the warming, the amplification of the warming by increasing water vapor and by decreasing snow cover overwhelms the negative feedback from the increasing cloud cover. So this is, you have seen this curve before. This is the thermometer record of surface air temperature. So what you see here is the temperature, this is the warming. This is relative to the period 1950 to 1980. The warming is greatest at high latitudes. Okay, this is because the snow and ice is melting. Okay, so there is amplification of the warming due to the albedo effect. Okay, so this is the surface is getting darker, more energy is absorbed. The bottleneck, how fast? Okay, the bottleneck to the warming is the ocean. These are observations derived from observations, the penetration of fossil fuel CO2 into the ocean. Here is the Atlantic, the Pacific in the middle, and the Indian Ocean on the bottom. And what you see here, the ocean, we have 4,000 meters of water in the And this is heated from above, okay? This is the CO2's coming from above, the pollutants, other things are coming in from above. The ocean is stably stratified, which means that it is really difficult for things to move down. So there's very few diffusion of chemicals and heat into the deep ocean. So what we see here is that in over 200 years of CO2 increase, the anthropogenic CO2 has only penetrated to 500 to 1,000 meters in the ocean. Okay, so this is not even a quarter of the way down in 200 years. So this is the point I want you to remember here is that the heat is going in the same way. So the ocean is warming up slowly, and as the ocean warms up, then there's more evaporation, more water vapor, etc. So this is a continuing loop that is going on. So that when we look at the climate models, then this is a recent model, two recent models. You have seen this graph before, is that when we put in all the forcing, okay, the CO2 increase, the methane, the nitrous oxide, the aerosols, the volcanoes, solar variability, the climate models can reproduce to the lowest order the trends, the global, the large-scale pictures of climate change, not only in the atmosphere, but also in the penetration of heat. This figure starts in 1993 because this is when we first started having consistent observations from drifting buoys in the ocean. So how fast? Let's look at the bottom figure first. This is, as I said, the ocean has not warmed up. The full potential of the ocean warming has not been realized. So this is if we held the CO2 at 380 parts per million and held it constant for the 21st century by some magic, there's still warming in the pipeline. This is unrealized warming, or you call it committed warming. This is warming still in the pipeline. And we're talking about 2 degrees, okay? We're halfway, we approximately realize half the warming potential of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere now, okay? And if we have further increased CO2 in the atmosphere, business as usual, so CO2 in this particular scenario increasing from 380 to 680 parts per million over the next century, then you can see widespread warming globally. And this is huge, okay? This is to 2100, so this is the last 20 years minus the 1980s, okay? 100-year difference in these plots. So this is another 3 to 4 degrees in the pipeline, at least at high latitudes. So you've seen this a lot. This is the melting glacier. And the reason we're saying it's important, it is urgent and everything is not just it is melting, the glaciers are melting more rapidly. This is from Yunnan, the glacier, and I don't think that this was meant to be off the ice. It was supposed to be on the glacier. Okay, and this is from Greenland. You can see the river forming. 2 students fell into the river. This is not normal in Greenland, okay, to have a river that carries the heat. So it's not just that we are seeing, we finally, after doing calculations and saying high latitude amplification of the warming, all of that, not only is the data showing that the ice is melting, that the warming is fastest at high latitude, the theory is correct. What is concerning us is that the amplification, the faster the ice is melting, the faster the glaciers disappear, the faster the warming will take place. Okay, so this is, the alarm is not just it is happening, but this is saying that it will be happening faster. Another concern is the calculation I've been doing, is that I talked about the fossil fuel present day. The atmospheric abundance is only half of what we have released into the atmosphere. The remaining half have gone into the land and ocean. Now with the ocean, with warming, you're heating from above, the stratification, the ocean is going to be more stably stratified. It is tougher for stuff to mix down. Okay, so the ocean's capacity to store carbon will decrease because of pH changes, because of the warming, because of the stratification, because of the circulation. Also for the land, with warming comes drying. You know, we have this debated whether there's going to be increase or decrease precipitation. That doesn't matter. You have to look at the soil. Plants grow in the soil, and so when it's warmer, there's evaporation. Okay, so that where it is warm, for example, in the summer in the southeast, in the tropics, warming means drier. Doesn't matter whether it's more rain or less rain. Warming means dry because the evaporation exceeds the precipitation supply. Okay, so with drying, then the plants are not going to do so well. And so what we have is that with warming and drying, both the land is decreasing its capacity to store carbon. Okay, the ocean is decreasing its capacity to store carbon. Okay, and this is the airborne, how much, you know, the fraction of fossil fuel that goes into the atmosphere. But not only that, the point I want to make here is that this scenario, CO2 emission scenario, is very rapid. Okay, so when it's very rapid, it is faster than the CO2 can get through that bottleneck I showed you before. Okay, so that means that there's even more CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere, which means faster warming still. So what I want to end up with is to tell you that I can't summarize 25 years of research in 15 minutes, but I want you to give you a flavor that the science is there. Okay, the global warming is real. The models are doing a reasonable job of at least getting the bottom line. Okay, we're still working on the details of whether the Southeast or, you know, San Francisco versus LA, Northern California, Southern California, but the global large-scale picture is there. We have, for the 21st century, we have drying of the tropics, and so there's reduced carbon uptake, and that accelerates the warming. Stable stratification in the ocean, we reduce the thermohaline circulation, we reduce the carbon uptake, and that also accelerates the warming. And when the fossil fuel emission is faster than the land and ocean can take it up, that also accelerates the warming. Okay, so everything, and of course the destabilization of the glaciers with the albedo the surface getting darker and absorbing more sunlight, that accelerates the warming. So where we are is not whether there will be warming, but how fast will the warming occur. I'd like to end with this figure. If I were the planetary doctor, I would tell the patient that there's a fever. You have a fever. Not only do you have a fever, the lungs are not very clear. This is not dust. This is the haze over China, and this is the entire country. And the prescription is reduction at the source, okay? Chinese medicine, we work on regulating the system. We do not write a prescription. We don't go to the doctor, write a prescription to say, deal with something that I have, okay? I'm prescribing for the fever and for the very hazy air. It's really reduction in the carbon emission. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have one announcement, a change in the program. In your program, you will see Dr. Xiao from China is on this session, and in fact, she was not able to travel here due to unfortunate circumstances, and so we will not be able to hear from her at this meeting. My assignment has been to summarize the topic of the impacts of global warming. It's a tremendously huge topic. In fact, we teach many courses on that subject at Berkeley, and I'm sure at the universities you all come from. I'd like to begin with a summary of just the major categories of impact with an assessment that's based on the consensus of a huge number of my colleagues who study these issues as to the level of certainty that we can attach to this description of an impact. So I've given 3 stars, which is the highest level of certainty, to the categories of impact that are shown here. 3 stars mean near unanimity among the scientists active in the field, a high level of confidence in the predictions. The science is understood, the facts are well agreed upon, and the predictions are robust. One of these is a huge increase in the intensity, frequency, and duration of harmful summer heat waves. A second is sea level rise of at least a half a meter by the end of this century, and with that, the loss of some island nations in the South Pacific. The melting of glaciers and of sea ice is another impact which we're already seeing the beginning stages of, and it will accelerate. With that will go the loss of alpine and Arctic habitat. I've singled out polar bears as a particularly charismatic species, which is now a candidate for the endangered species list because of global warming. Reduced snowpack in mountainous areas of the world, and because snowmelt is a major source of irrigation water for agriculture, this means a loss of water for crops dependent on that source. And then finally in this category of very high certainty is massive coral reef dieback around in the tropical, subtropical areas of the world due to coral bleaching. A 2-star category means that a consensus exists on the underlying science and many of the facts, but work is needed to sharpen the predictions and give us a better sense of exactly what we're going to be in store for. One of them is increased intensity and possibly frequency of hurricanes and droughts. A second is reduced crop yields because of extreme events such as storms and other kinds of weather anomalies and persistent drought. And a third is increased threat of major wildfires, both in wildland forests and also in the forests that surround human habitation around the world. And my third category, which is by no means one in which we are so uncertain that we don't need to think about it, here what I would characterize the 1-star category as meaning is that there's agreement that the problem is real and of serious importance, but there are data gaps and some of the basic science still needs to be resolved. One of these issues would be a sea level rise of up to, that should be 20 feet, not 20 meters, because of Greenland and Antarctic ice melt. I call this bipolar disorder because we're losing ice at both poles, and with it will come a large rise in sea level, but we're not able today to predict just how fast that ice melt will occur and what the prognosis is, say, 100 years from now. With a 20-foot or a 7-meter rise in sea level, we're going to see a catastrophic level of damage to huge numbers of people around the world and to much coastal infrastructure. In this category goes an extinction episode of biodiversity comparable to what happened at the KT boundary 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct. With that loss of species will come catastrophic loss of ecosystem services, which we are all dependent upon. And thirdly in this category is the risk of a major spread of infectious tropical and subtropical diseases to the mid-latitudes. Now, I want to make one small point here, but I think it's important. That is that there are many problems we face, and Professor Kang summarized some of these. In Inez Fung's language, not only is the patient having a fever, which is global warming, but her forests are growing bald rapidly through deforestation. Acid indigestion is afflicting our patient, and the patient is suffering cataracts from increased ultraviolet radiation from the ozone hole. And even though the nations of the world have developed a workable solution to the problem of the stratospheric ozone hole, those chlorofluorocarbons are going to reside in the stratosphere for many decades, and so that problem still exists. Now, what this figure illustrates is that these problems don't exist in isolation. They interact with each other. I call this the sinister side of synergy. We're used to thinking of synergy as a good thing. After all, the Toyota hybrid talks about the synergy drive. So synergy is good, but there's a sinister side to it, which is that the interactions between things can add up destructively. And I call this harmful reinforcement, and I give it a plus sign when two of these categories of impact interact with each other so that the sum together is worse than the sum of the parts in isolation. In some cases, there are helpful cancellations between stresses, but in most cases, when we review all the literature on these different categories of impact, we see harmful reinforcing interactions between these. For example, deforestation increases the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, causing more global warming. But global warming increases the risk of wildfire, which is destructive to forests. In addition to these interactions, we also have to deal with feedbacks. Professor Fung introduced that topic, and just to show you the perspective that I, as an ecologist, take on this, for 20 years now, we've been looking at how climate change will affect ecosystems. Ecosystem functions, biogeochemical fluxes, such as the exchange of trace gases like carbon dioxide and methane between the biosphere and the atmosphere, and also how it will affect species composition, who lives where on the planet, and drought stress from climate change, and the influence of climate warming on the decay rates of organic matter and soil can all lead to a causal connection between global warming and these ecosystem processes. But ecosystems also affect the climate. What grows on the land surface affects energy and water exchange between the land surface and the atmosphere, and that affects the climate. Biogeochemical fluxes influence how much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that affects the climate. Just to give you one example of a feedback, if you take our best general circulation models used to project global warming, and let's say we go back in time to 15, 18,000 years ago. The last ice age was ending, the planet was warming, and the massive ice sheet that covered North America and elsewhere in the world was retreating upward, northward toward the polar region. How fast did that ice sheet retreat? Well, we know how fast it retreated because we have all kinds of data that we can use to reconstruct the rate of ice melt. Well, if we take our best models of ice melt and our models of what happened over the period post the last glacial maximum, what we discover is that if we do an obvious thing, which is to replace the ice with rock and rubble and silt that would be in the wake of a retreating ice sheet, we find that the models underpredict the rate at which the ice sheet retreated. However, if we put spruce trees into the model, because spruce trees grew up in the wake of the retreating ice, then the ground surface is darker, there's more absorption of sunlight at the surface, and the region of the planet where the spruce trees are growing behind the retreating ice absorbs more sunlight, warms more rapidly, and that speeds up the rate of ice retreat, and lo and behold, you get the right answer for the rate of retreat if you put the spruce trees into the model. One way of thinking about this is the spruce trees weren't following the ice north, they were chasing it. And if we don't include biological effects like that in our climate models, we may get a wrong perception of what the future will look like. Another most important example of feedback is implicit in the Vostok core data. The ice core from the Antarctic gives us a record of carbon dioxide and methane and temperature over many hundreds of thousands of years. Here I've just shown 160,000 years worth of carbon dioxide and temperature data, and as you've seen earlier this morning, those data sets track each other rather nicely. Now, the CO2 release during the warming must cause more warming because we know CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And CO2 uptake during cooling periods must accelerate the cooling. So, why did the carbon dioxide get released during the warming? Unfortunately, we don't know, but we know it's coming either from the oceans or from soils or from the other parts of the land surface. And we need to know that because the effect of this carbon dioxide release during warming periods is not in our conventional climate models. Models like the type Professor Fung described are now beginning to describe this. But I was interested, along with Margaret Torn, my collaborator, in looking at how we could deduce from the Vostok data what the magnitude of that feedback effect is. And in a paper, Torn and Harte, Geophysical Research Letters, which will be published this Friday, we have published a calculation showing from the Vostok data, with no model assumptions, is direct data analysis, we can estimate what the effect of this feedback will be if it operates as it has over the last 700,000 years, if it operates over the next 100 years. And what we calculate is that if you take a climate model that, let's say, predicts a 5.8 degrees Celsius upper limit for the warming by the year 2100, ignoring that feedback, now you put the feedback in, and instead of 5.8 degrees at the upper limit, it goes up to 7.7 degrees. At the lower limit, you don't get as big an effect, and this has to do with the mathematics of feedback. There's an asymmetry. But the interesting thing about this is that the positive feedbacks exert this asymmetric effect on warming. The upper limit expands much faster than the lower limit when you put in these missing feedbacks. It's intrinsic to these positive feedbacks that it exerts this asymmetry in the range of uncertainty. So when you see a projection like the climate is going to be 3 degrees plus or minus 1 degree warmer, that upper limit may be bigger than you think and asymmetric around the mean estimate. The other reason for concern is that when we look at all the different feedbacks that exist, we find that are not included in our current models, the preponderance of them, as summarized in a recent paper by Lashoff et al. In Annual Reviews of Energy and Environment, the preponderance of these feedbacks is positive, meaning not positive in the sense that they're good for you, but positive in the sense that they will accelerate the warming. So we don't know where the carbon and the methane are coming from. We'd like to know, and we'd also like to know what other kinds of feedbacks we can expect. So I want to turn now, just very briefly, to 2 experimental studies that I've been involved in. One up in the Colorado Rockies, which started, the idea for this originated 20 years ago, when we decided we better get some on-the-ground, direct understanding of how climate warming will affect ecosystems. So up in the Colorado Rockies, we set up in the late 80s what is now a long-term warming experiment, because it's still going on, to heat experimental plots with infrared radiation mimicking a global warming future. And you can see in the upper left the effect of those heaters. It's to melt snow earlier than in the control plots. That earlier snow melt is exactly what's predicted in the general circulation models, but now we can study what it does to an ecosystem. We can look at global warming before it gets to look at us. And so here's one example of an interesting impact. Up in these plots in the alpine meadows, we have beautiful flowers. In fact, it's the sustenance of the economy of Crested Butte in summer is based on its wildflower festival, which brings many, many hundreds of tourists into the county to look at the flowers. Now, what's happened is that the flowering plants, like the daisies, have literally bit the dust in the warming scenario, under the heaters. If their flowering success is down by threefold in the heated plots compared to the control plots, their biomass is stunted. And instead, what was a relatively rare plant in those plots, namely sagebrush, is growing like gangbusters. It loves the heat, loves the dryness, and it's taking over the plots. One of the effects of that is a feedback that we hadn't anticipated. If you look at the reflection coefficient of the daisies and the other flowering plants and compare it to the reflectivity of the sagebrush, sagebrush is darker. It's darker because it's evolved to create a warmer climate around itself because it's more competitive when it's warmer. So the darker plants cause more warming. The plants that are disappearing were brighter. Brighter plants cool the climate locally. Darker plants warm it. And so there's a feedback where locally, not globally, locally this effect of the plant redistribution is to cause a local warming. We did a calculation. If you just look within that region of the alpine, subalpine meadows, we find that a 20% change in the regional plant cover will have an effect on local summertime climate that's comparable to a doubling of carbon dioxide. The other feedback that we saw very dramatically in these experimental plots was that in the heated plots, the carbon dived in the first 4 or 5 years of the experiment. It reduced about 20% compared to the carbon levels in the control plots because of the warming. And it had to do with something that Professor Fung mentioned. As you warm and dry plots, the plants don't take up as much carbon as they would otherwise, and that leads to a net loss of carbon because the soils continue to decompose the carbon at the previous rate. Now, what's interesting is this effect showed up early in the experiment, and the control plots' carbon levels stayed relatively constant until the year 2000, when they began to drop. And the reason for that was that from 2000 to 2004, there was a severe drought in the western United States. And that drought caused our control plots to start looking like the heated plots did in the wetter years. And so we have an example here of nature imitating experiment and, in a sense, validating the results from the heating. Another experiment is really the brainchild of Professor Julia Klein, and she worked with me. She was my graduate student, I'm proud to say, and together she and I and a collaborator in China, Professor Xiao, have published an article in Ecology Letters summarizing some of the effects of an experiment that's carried out in the Tibetan Plateau. And the plateau experiment consists also of heating plots and also doing a grazing experiment where we can exclude grazing or simulate grazing, as the case may be. And what is found and what's summarized in that article is that there was a loss of species in the heated plots over the 5 years of the experiment. So biodiversity is taking a hit from global warming in this experimental study. There was decreased plant species diversity, decreased vegetation production, and decreased ecosystem services, because one of the things that Professor Klein did was to measure how many of these lost species provided medicine to the local people, how many provided forage for their grazing animals, and she found significant losses of these ecosystem services provided by these plants. Also, as in Colorado, a shrub expansion. So critical pastoral resources in Tibet are vulnerable to warming. Land management grazing can partially mediate the warming effects. This is one of the surprising findings of the work. Now, how do we extend these local studies from local plots to global scale? The usual approach is to do some kind of modeling. We have to scale up this detailed, sound knowledge that we acquire from experimental controlled studies in particular ecosystems, but we have to scale that up to large scales. How do we do it? Well, one very widely used approach is called the climate envelope approach. And the concept here is that we can think of each species or cluster of species as having a set of temperature and precipitation requirements. It's happy under these climate conditions. It doesn't do well under those. And then we can ask, well, what are those conditions like where the species is currently found? That's its climate envelope, the climate conditions where you now see it. And where will it go in the future? It will go to wherever those conditions will be found in the future. And we can work that out if we have believable climate models. course, to know what the future climate will be like, we, in part, need to know where the species will be, so there's a bit of a circularity here. And so we need coupled models that can solve a rather difficult problem. There are limits to the climate envelope approach. I'm not going to go into all of these, but just to mention two, that it ignores barriers to the movement of species. Basically, these models tend to assume that species can migrate or disperse to wherever they'll be happy, but because of habitat fragmentation, deforestation, and geographic barriers to the ability of plants and animals to shift their range, you can't assume that plants and animals are free to move to where the climate will make them happy. You also find that these models tend to lump all species into, each species into a category, the species, or worse yet, into a cluster of species. But in fact, populations within species may respond differentially to climate change, and so we have to deal with that. I just want to say in conclusion, just a couple of policy-related comments. My colleague, Professor Sokolow at Princeton, has come up with the concept of stabilization wedges. Shown here are the number of gigatons of carbon emitted per year, with 7 being the current emissions. And projecting out to the year 2050, you make some scenario, perhaps doubled emissions under a business as usual scenario. And then, if we want to get down to stabilization of emissions, we have to have a flat curve rather than a rising curve. And if we want to stabilize the climate, we have to come down below today's level of emissions. And each of these wedges shown here might represent a technology that can contribute to the achievement of those stabilization goals. A technology such as energy efficiency or wind power or biomass. Now, that's one way to think about the challenge, but I want to make the point that there's also destabilization wedges that we need to worry about. The effects of feedbacks, loss of carbon sinks, and other effects are going to make the problem worse than is currently projected in these business as usual models. And the size of this destabilization wedge is really a measure of the burden, the extra burden on future generations. And which energy trajectory we choose, which population trajectory we choose is going to affect the severity of that problem. In the interest of time, I'll skip that slide, and you can read the summary for yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. The next speaker is Xiangming Xiao. He is a research professor in New Hampshire and also the director of their Geographical Information Systems Center. Research professor at the Institute for the Study for the Study of Earth, Oceans, and Space Sciences at the University of New Hampshire.
Good morning, and thank you, everybody. It's my honor to be here and to share some our research thoughts and our experience. And as from the first 5 talks this morning, we all see a very important point of view is our human activities are very closely intertwined with natural systems. So the climate is changing, and it has a significant impact on agriculture and on human public health. In these next 10 to 15 minutes, I really like to share some thoughts about the land use change issues and the climate change issues, and also try to focus on the emerging issues in that's like the public health, trying to highlight some uncertainty issue we have on some capacity we are building based on our experience in China and some future activities in our group. The climate change is changing, but very important to point out the rate of climate change is not uniformly across the globe. A number of studies show here on the high latitude, but here I want to point out if we look at China, there is a place is on Qinghai Tibet Plateau. That's a large area, it's a high altitude. It's a roofly world. It has a large area of 2.5 million square kilometers. It's a very important role in the climate system in Asia and particularly in China, but it's also a hotspot of climate changes. Here's some recent report point out is the temperature rise by 0.9 degrees C since the 1990s. But at the same time, you also report the increase in soil or permafrost. At the same time, you also see the report recent a week ago, there's the report shows the decrease of glacier area by 7% per year. So those are a number of physical climate change in the Tibetan Plateau, but it has a very strong economic impact. Just imagine all the major rivers in China, Yangtze, Yellow River, are originally in Tibetan Plateau. So what's that impact for the socio-economically water resource is very significant. At the same time, it's all going to have significance in terms of carbon and the water cycle. I think Professor John Harte shows on his study on the Tibetan Plateau on the worm experiment. That's a very fine-scale species-level studies. At the same time, this Chinese academic science and Chinese university has also developed a new tool, using new tool to do an ecosystem-level measurement, trying to understand and monitoring what change in terms of CO2 and on the water and energy. Here's a two case study showing there's two major efforts in China. One is the China Flux. There's a number of study sites across China in different ecosystems. The other effort is led by a group of U.S. scientists and China scientists. It's a kind of voluntary network. It's a U.S.-China Carbon Consortium. Both groups are all employ the eddy-flux tower network. It provides you measurement of CO2, water, energy at half-hour time steps. So far, throughout entire China, there's about 50 sites. So it's just to take an example, like the United States, we have over 100 eddy-flux tower sites. So in the next few years, it's likely we're going to have a larger number of data coming from this network. So those data are going to be very useful for us to understand what control the carbon and the nitrogen flux and the water flux in different ecosystems, and how that response or dynamic of carbon, nitrogen, water in response to climate and other land use issues. On the other hand, we also like to see there's substantial progress in terms of satellite data monitoring and diagnosis, because no matter how many eddy-flux towers you have, how many field work you've done, there's a large area we've never been seen, we never know it. So the satellite provide a very powerful tool for doing that. It can provide important data sets to monitor it or to do a diagnosis to see where our Earth has problems. Here I will show you some example is how that satellite data and the modeling compare with the eddy-flux tower data measurement, trying to demonstrate the capacity of satellite modeling approach. Here's three ecosystem type: wetland, shrubland, and meadow. They're all in the same similar location. I think John Harte's is a field experiment site, so it's all in Tibetan plateaus. And here's the graphic will show you the red color is the estimated data from very fine observation from eddy-flux tower half-hourly data in terms of gross primary productions. And the black line is the model we developed from the satellite image. The fundamental progress of this model is we began to look at the photosynthesis process from the chlorophyll content, so the fundamental the process studies. So really show you there's a greater potential the satellite data and modeling can use to understand the Earth are changing and to what degree they are changing. So those eddy-flux tower data are done some in the natural ecosystem also done in the managed ecosystems. So I'm going to move a little bit on the managed ecosystems. For mostly, we all very well know is the land use, land cover change has two aspects. One is the land cover conversion. You change the forest to cropland, you change the grassland to cropland. The other aspect is the land use intensifications. So if we look at the data from 1960 to present, the most the activity is focused on the land use intensifications. The main thing is about crop intensity. In this case, we show you in southern China, you have two crops, one winter wheat, one's rice paddy. Then you also, the irrigation, the area for irrigation are increased substantially from India all the way to China across part of Asia countries. The third component is the fertilization. So the fertilizer used in the farm of China is much higher compared to the United States levels. So those are major land use intensification issues. It's very interesting to point out is most of the climate model has a component to address what's the impact of land cover conversion for the climate change studies. However, very few models, they have no or very simple representation on the cropland intensifications. So those has some uncertainty for the climate predictions. So there's a potential we don't know is this land cover intensification going to make the climate change even faster? That gives back to the Inez Fung's question, how fast we are. So we don't know that. We don't have not quantified what's the role of intensification there. On the other hand, because we don't include in intensification very well in our model, so what's the impact of the change on this cropland intensification? We're still not very well quantified. This is going to affect all these socio-economic importance of particular food security issues. So I'm going to move to the third issue in my talk is about the infection disease. The point I want to make is the infection disease, it has a component of climate. It also have a very link strongly with our human activities. So here an example I want to show you, because recently we are involved with international community. Here's since 2003, the bird flu outbreak happened in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in Vietnam, and then spread around in China. This is a distribution of the disease across the China. So at the very, very beginning, everybody thinking about it is mostly related to the domesticated poultry, the dark chickens. Until 2005, the first few case outbreak in wild birds. So this is a lake of Qinghai in this place. They found one outbreak in north part of the Qinghai areas. In that particular, let me just show one slide is here. This Qinghai Lake is a breeding site for many Asian birds. So the bird can come from south of Qinghai all the way to the north part. So it's a very important place. So the issue becomes why the birds are become so important and so sensitive to the bird flu issues. These issues is because our human activities, I was trying to give you an outline here, it's our human activities has created a certain landscape complex to our, you have a natural wetland, you have a paddy rice agriculture, as we see. We see the rice paddy. We also, in Southeast Asia, in China, there's substantial increase in area for fishery ponds. So it's these complex land use changes create a possibility for these, the ducks on the farmer side have a strong interaction with the migratory birds. So the migratory birds can nowadays begin to using not only the natural wetland as their habitat, it's also going to use the agricultural land as the habitat, particularly in the fall and the winter season. This happened in Southeast Asia. It's also happened in California. California, you have a large areas, particularly central California, you have a large area of paddy rice. After the harvest of the paddy rice, the farmer here used to burn the material. Because of the air pollution quality control, the farmer began to change their practice. They're going to till the fields and flood it in the fields. So that becomes a wetland. The wetland are used by all kinds of wild birds. So the same thing happened in China, happened in Southeast Asia. So that's the mechanism of the potential transmission between the disease. The point I really want to see is about this. We talk about the climate and the weather. The point I want to make is the climate also has a role in the emergence of a number of infection diseases. This bird flu is just one of the case study here. One reason, if we think about the Qinghai Tibet case, it happened in early May. One reason is because the temperature rise in the Tibet Plateau, the plant, the soil, or the growing season become much earlier. There's one side provide a habitat is suitable for wild birds to come in. On the other side, there is some evidence to show the onset of the summer monsoon of Indian Ocean is also getting earlier. So these two together make this system very suitable for the infection diseases to come together. So these are the important things. So these are studies on, in order to understand that, there's need for climatologists to work on with these epidemiologists and also work on the public health. This is my last slide. I'm trying to see, in order to address this issue of climate change, land use, and emergency disease, we really need to do a number of things: the capacity building, the international collaboration, and interdisciplinary studies. Particularly, we need to emphasize this education and communication among the different countries because it's a global issue. So I'll end up, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we're already running on Berkeley time. That means that we will have the discussion now until 11:15, and we'll start the next panel at its appointed time, but breaks will be on a as-needed basis. You can just get up anytime if you want to go out. We're joined here, in addition, by John Harte, Professor Xiao, Professor Fung, and also Julia Klein, who will be an assistant professor at Colorado State, Fort Collins, and who did some of the work on the Tibetan Plateau that Professor Harte showed. And now's your opportunity with Professor Fung, especially if you wanted to ask a question to someone who generates all those climate change predictions that everyone else uses. Now's your chance, and they may also want to ask questions of each other. So, any questions?
Yeah. Are you going to call on people? Or?
Would you like?
If I can see them, I'll call on them. Yeah. Is this on? Yeah. Any hands?
Mark?
There's a hand right here. Yes. We'll repeat the question up here.
The question is the warming and drying of the tropics, how that combination changes affects the lowland forest versus the cloud forest. The lowland forest, obviously, with the drying, even with the deep roots, it's the availability of water for photosynthesis. So with the decrease in soil moisture, and it depends on the degree, various models calculate different degrees of warming and drying. There is a range of decreased photosynthesis to the Hadley Center model where the rainforest just died. Okay, and it's replaced because there's a tremendous warming and drying that's calculated in that particular model. And so there is demise of the tropical rainforest, and so there is a lot of litter decomposition, and so there's a huge carbon climate feedback, as Professor Harte mentioned. With cloud forests, they also will not do well because the fog is going to, the condensation level is going to go to a higher level. And so there really is a hydraulic issue of how tall a tree can grow, and the tree, as far as we know, cannot grow to reach the clouds. So it is not likely that they will do well.
Other questions? There was a hand over there.
With the recent reports of thawing of Siberian permafrost, huge methane outgassing, how does that color your
It's going to be sooner. So the issue is the warming of the permafrost. Permafrost stores a lot of carbon. I think about the tropics as the fast spender in terms of carbon fast in, fast out, whereas the tundra and the permafrost is the hoarder. Okay, so there's a small income, but there's a slow decomposition. There's huge storage of carbon. So with the thawing, first what happens would be methane release. Methane, with decomposition, when there is not enough oxygen, methane is released, and each molecule, I'm saying per molecule of methane, in terms of the warming potential, is worth 20 times, more at 20 times as effective as one molecule of CO2. So there will be acceleration of warming. So when the drying, so what we calculate is warming at high latitude when it's cooler, then there could be more rain. So if the soils remain flooded, then there could be more methane emission. With the drying of the soils, then we switch from methane to CO2 emission. So either way, we're talking about the rate of warming, and I'm trying to figure out how that does not, I mean, that's accelerating the warming as well. And also the permafrost melting, we would change from an albedo, from a brighter albedo to a darker albedo, also accelerating the warming.
I'll just add one more comment on the methane question. Margaret Torn's doctoral dissertation studied how methane consumption by soil bacteria is affected by climate change. Ecosystems affect methane in the atmosphere not just by how much they emit, but how much they actually consume by what are called methanotrophic bacteria. And she found that under drier soil conditions, the rate at which bacteria consume atmospheric methane decreases, and that's effectively like adding more methane to the atmosphere. Another positive feedback. Yeah.
One of the last set of slides, if I caught it right, said 7% decrease in the glacier area and on the plateau, 7% per year.
Yeah.
Can we draw a straight line, or is that too unscientific to say that's 15 years or 20 years?
I would guess that's the maximum. I would do it the minute, because of the positive feedback. Yeah. The minute the ice starts melting, it will go faster.
One place where that projection has been done, and I think reliably, is Lonnie Thompson's work on Kilimanjaro, where by the year 2020, the snows of Kilimanjaro will be no more. Yes.
One of the arguments that President Bush decided to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol is the lack of adequate science back in research. I'd like to hear from you, to John and Inez, what's your assessment of the state of climate change science right now in order to make a convincing case for any significant move policy, and how much better science needs to do
The question was, could we summarize the state of climate science? How good is it? Is it good enough to base policy upon? I think that it should be clear from my comments on impacts that the state of that science is good enough to know that we should be very scared and it's time to act. And I think Inez's talk also gave reasons why we should trust the climate models as far as their projections of what the broad parameters of future warming are going to look like. And again, I can't believe that anybody on this panel is going to say that there's some missing piece of the picture that warrants delaying policy action. We should be acting as soon as possible to do as much as we can to slow this problem down and ultimately reverse it.
I think if you looked in 2001, there was an Academy report on climate change science in which it was stated that it is likely that the warming, and that's up till 2001, was most likely due to human activities. And I want to remind you that the 5 warmest years in the long record are 5 warmest years in 1998, 2002, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so when the president made a statement about that, it was prior to the 4 warmest years. But June 6, 2001, there was the Rose Garden speech where the president said that climate change is a serious problem. However, there is a lot of uncertainty. So in the absence of absolute scientific uncertainty, how one makes a decision is based very much on one's values. So one of the questions that was asked in the 2001 report was, have scientists determined what is a safe level of greenhouse gas? And we struggled very long and hard with that, because at the end of a lecture, when I have a freshman class in this room, the CO2 level, I told you, ambient CO2 is about 380 now. At the end of a lecture, it's about 1,000 ppm. So I don't, when the students fall asleep, I don't think it's my lecture. But the issue there is the safety is related to the readiness of the infrastructure to deal with the change. Katrina is a statement of not ready. Okay, so that's one aspect. If you read the president's speech, February 14th, 2002, that's the Clear Sky speech, then it is still saying that climate change is a serious problem, but scientists have not figured out what to do about it. Okay, hence this is why we are talking. It's why, what do we do? Acknowledging that this is a problem, okay, we have to come up with workable prototype or solutions that can be implemented. And I think that the acknowledgement that it's a serious problem is always there. So it is our responsibility to come up with what to do.
A question over here.
Peter Schwartz. John Harte and Inez Fung. You showed right at the very end of your talk destabilization equations to complement Rob-Socklow's stabilization equation. Is it plausible that what you've now described as destabilization equations might trigger more rapid climate change, abrupt climate change, and even at the extreme case, an end to the interrelation?
Did everybody hear the question? Do the feedback effects and other contributing factors that cause the climate problem to be even worse than we've thought it was, do they have the potential to so destabilize the climate as to tip us into a new ice age or some other catastrophe? When will it end? Yeah. The most honest answer to when would the Ice Age have ended if we weren't doing anything is that we really don't know for sure. There's uncertainty in our ability to project when we would start to be descending into the next ice age, in part because if you look back at the last 7 or 8 ice ages, they have differing durations. The interglacial periods have somewhat different durations, and we don't know what the right analog is for the future. But yes, there's the potential for global warming to trigger huge, irreversible consequences. My own view is that the most serious of these is the melting of Greenland ice and West Antarctic ice, triggering not a more rapid descent into the next ice age, but vast amounts of damage to people and other species on the planet.
I would like to add to that. We are not going to go into an ice age if our CO2 is going up. Physics tells you no way. There is no way. If the CO2 is up there radiating down heat, there's going to be redistribution of heat, but it is difficult for the entire planet to cool when you're warming it with the CO2. Yeah. So all the calculations we tried in our calculations, we have to lower the CO2 in order to get an ice age. Okay, there's no way, unless, I don't know how. Okay, in previous, even though orbitally we may be due for an ice age, you know, with a change in the solar input, with the CO2, there's no way we can get there.
Yep. Question in the back.
Professor Harte, in your talk you spoke about looking at the historical record, the coincidence of CO2 with ice melting and temperature. You said we're still trying to figure that one out. I was wondering if you could offer some of our best hypotheses today and maybe your own personal favorites.
Okay. Well, when I said that there's a puzzle, what I, of course, meant is that we don't know exactly what mechanisms were causing the release of carbon into the atmosphere during paleoclimate times of warming. And among the candidates are, of course, I mean, there's really two. It's not from outer space. So it's the oceans or it's the land. And if it's the oceans, it will have to do with ocean chemistry and ocean circulation. The carbonate cycle in the ocean is a source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere under warming conditions because of the nature of the chemistry of the carbonate system in the ocean. But it doesn't look big enough to explain it all. A second possible source would be from the land, from soil, for example, the kind of thing we saw in our Colorado experiment, where we saw a 20% drop in terrestrial ecosystem carbon. It turns out ecosystems on the land store 5 times as much carbon as the atmosphere does. So if you lose 20% of the land carbon to the atmosphere, it's equivalent to a doubling of carbon dioxide. So that's a possible explanation. But we don't have enough data yet to say that's the answer. And that's one of the things that ecologists and climatologists are very aggressively working on. Yes?
As the floating Arctic ice melts and slows along global water, will increase the emission of CO2 in that
could you say that again?
Global water in the Arctic.
Yes.
You get increased volatility of CO2 in that water. And that doesn't reduce the atmosphere.
Well, it can. The estimates of this, the question was, as you reduce sea ice in the Arctic, you have more water surface available to take up more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And yes, that can happen. The loss of ice in some regions of the world can be a place where you may get more carbon dioxide going the other way from the oceans to the atmosphere. It can work either way. But I think the more important effect is going to actually be the warming effect on the ocean chemistry. What you could do is trigger a major change in the circulation, the conveyor belt, and so forth, and that could have interesting implications for carbon balance. But I don't know enough about that topic to be able to tell you exactly what that's likely to do.
In our calculation, it's not just the warming, it's changes in the pH of the ocean. So with the CO2, what I showed you, the fossil fuel CO2 going into the ocean, the ocean is getting more acidic. And with the acidification of the ocean, then the carbonic chemistry pushes to the CO2, so there's actually more outgassing from the acidification. So there are the physical changes in the stratification, in the thermohaline circulation, changes in the upwelling, etc. All of those together act to decrease the storage of carbon in the ocean. There could be local areas where what you're talking about is important, but globally it's decreasing storage.
There's a question over here.
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
Yep.
Here.
Yes. You have the last word, CS.
This panel and summarize half pages. You said what you're concluding scientifically about this whole question, and by the end of maybe tomorrow, half pages, and for the news media, and how you think it's multi-package. What kind of statement you can write in summary and explain what is the problem. I think that because a sign at the end of this oral session.
Okay. I hope you're not asking that because we were so confusing that it's hard to do it. Yeah, we will do that. I think that's a very good suggestion. Yeah. Everybody happy with that?
Yes, I got my homework assignment from Professor King. I'll do it.
Okay.
All right, let's thank all of our speakers, and we can move on to the next panel.